The big story of the day is about Merrick Garland. So Merrick Garland is now up for nomination. He has been nominated, and the Senate Judiciary Committee is going through their formal process where they are going to be asking him questions, holding a hearing, advice and consent of the Senate to confirm him into Joe Biden's cabinet position. And so before we start talking about Merrick Garland specifically, I want to flesh out this position, the Attorney General of the United States, because if you're a lawyer, you kind of know what this is. But if you're a non-lawyer, if you're somebody that doesn't kind of exist in this space, then you may not know exactly what they do. We have so many different agencies in this country now. We've got, Office of Inspector General, Office of Legal Counsel. We've got, the Attorney General. Then we've got the Solicitor General. And you've got all these different sort of legal-ish types of divisions within our government. It's hard to make sense of who does what and when and how do they do it. So let's learn a little bit more about the Attorney General of the United States. And I'm just going right off of Wikipedia here, and then we're going to look to the Department of Justice itself just to educate ourselves. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. According to Wikipedia, the United States Attorney General leads the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice, it is a massive entity in the U.S., and the Attorney General is the chief lawyer of the federal government of the United States, okay? And so you can't really even wrap your head around how big of a job that is. The entire United States, okay? If you got in trouble for, DUI or shoplifting, stealing a candy bar, you would go hire a lawyer for you against the government. This is the government. This is the main lawyer for the entire federal government. 350 plus, 70 plus million people here, right? It's a big, big job, a lot of oversight. Back to Wikipedia, it says that the Attorney General serves as the principal advisor to the President of the United States on all legal matters. The Attorney General is a statutory member of the Cabinet of the United States. Under the Appointments Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the office holder is nominated by the President, then appointed with the advice and consent of the United States Senate, and then the Attorney General is supported by the Office of the Attorney General, which includes the executive staff and several deputies. And so we're right in this process right now. Merrick Garland is the current candidate who is, and so Wikipedia even says this, Monty Wilkinson is the current acting U.S. Attorney General since Joe Biden took office. He's expecting to serve as the acting Attorney General until Biden's nominee, Judge Merrick Garland, is confirmed by the United States Senate. So we're right in the middle of that process right now. Today was the first day of those hearings. We have some clips from Merrick Garland, some that I think are interesting. So what we're trying to do here in these confirmations hearings is just sort of, peel back the layers of the onion on this individual in particular and say, what is your philosophy going forward as the chief lawyer of this country? There are a lot of legal issues that we deal with on a regular basis. In fact, this show talks about most of them, but there are many that we do not talk about. And so you're trying to sort of glean in these interviews, what is his philosophy? What is he going to do? Is he going to be, focused on any particular issues? What is the due process type of mindset that this individual has? Where do they stand on certain fundamental issues like the constitutional rights and things like that? How do they interpret the Constitution? A lot of very important questions that are going to touch everybody in this country one way or another, because the law goes everywhere, right? And we all know that. So this is what the org chart looks like over at the Department of Justice. Massive entity, as I said. So you have the AG up here at the top. You've got the Deputy Attorney General down below. And then just a whole slew of other agencies. And I wanted to just call your attention to some of them. So, of course, we have the Civil Rights Division. We hear some of that today. We've got a tax division from the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General, which we have. Let's see what else we've got. The Office of the Solicitor General, and then we've got some of the major enforcement agencies that are all under sort of the stewardship of the Attorney General. You've got the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have the Criminal Division of the U.S. Attorneys. You've got the Bureau of Prisons, the U.S. Marshals Service. We have Interpol in Washington, the U.S. Attorney's Office. We got ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys. We got the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And so it just goes on and on and on. And you can see just how expansive this entity is. It's massive. It encompasses a lot. And so Judge Merrick Garland, he's the person who's going forward right now to determine if we can confirm him or not. We'll see what the senators want to do. A little history here. Congress passed the Judiciary Act 1789, which established the office of the Attorney General. Original duties were to prosecute and conduct all suits in the Supreme Court in which the United States shall be concerned, and to give his advice and opinion on questions of law when required by the President of the United States or when requested by the heads of departments. Some of these duties have been transferred over into the U.S. Solicitor General and the White House Counsel. DOJ, the Department of Justice, was established 1870 to support the Attorney General and the discharge of their duties. The Attorney General, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and the Secretary of Defense are regarded as the four most important cabinet officials in the United States because of their size and importance of their respective departments. And then Wikipedia gives us a little bit of an interesting tidbit here. So if you have multiple attorneys general, that's the proper way to say it. So it's not we have a whole lot of attorney generals with a plural at the end of generals. It's attorneys general. So when we had, I don't know, what was it? 12, 16 attorneys general sign onto that lawsuit that Ted Cruz was supporting around the 2020 election litigation that went up to the Supreme Court. Some people were saying, well, 20 attorney generals signed it. No, it was actually 20 attorneys general. Just a little bit of a fun fact right there. And so you can see massive, massive Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General. Big, big, big position. And these were the prior attorneys generals. Attorneys general are on this slide right here. See, I did it myself. We have, of course, in recent memory, Bill Barr. And if you don't know this, Bill Barr actually had served previously as the Attorney General from 1991 to 1993. You may remember Janet Reno from, I think those were the Waco days. We got John Ashcroft. We got Alberto Gonzalez during the Bush years. Then we get over to Obama. We got Michael Mukasey. Don't know how to say that last name. And then Eric Holder was a very, very long-running attorney general during the Obama years, 2009 to 2015. And then the last 2 years of Obama, we had Loretta Lynch before we got Jeff Sessions very briefly. Then we got Bill Barr. And now we're contemplating who's coming up next. And so it sounds like it's going to be this guy by the name of Merrick Garland. And so he is a former chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. So he's been in D.C., been a former chief judge from the Court of Appeals for this position. He's an American attorney. He's a jurist. He serves as the circuit judge for the Court of Appeals in D.C. on that court since 1997, and he was nominated to be the U.S. Attorney General. 68 years old right now. Married, went to Harvard Law School, went to Harvard College, and then went to Niles West High School. He's got two siblings. A little bit more about him. It looks like he was a native of Chicago, and he attended Harvard. He was a law clerk in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and then to the Judge Brennan in the Supreme Court of the United States. So a lot of corporate litigation, it sounds like. And then he was involved at the U.S. Department of Justice, prosecuting the Oklahoma City bombers. Right, and then this paragraph here on Wikipedia goes through some of the background on where he came from, and so this was actually something that was very controversial back during about 2016. If you recall, there was a judge by the name of Judge Scalia, one of my favorite judges, very interesting judge to read, very provocative, very sort of aggressive opinion, somebody who would come out and just use language beautifully. Now, a lot of people on, I would say, sort of the left wing of the judicial philosophy, the left wing of the courts, a lot of people who think more in the lines of sort of active liberty versus constitutional and I would say interpretation, textualism, which is where Scalia was. They don't like that. They don't like Scalia at all. And so what happened back in March of 2016 is Scalia died unexpectedly and sort of just very, very suddenly. And this was a moment in time when Democrats largely thought that the balance of the court might be able to sort of flip or start reverting back towards the left because Scalia had passed. Obama was the president. He would get to nominate somebody else, and they were going to nominate, of course, a Democratic left-ish judge, and that was Merrick Garland. But unfortunately for Merrick Garland, the problem there was that the Republicans held the Senate, and so Mitch McConnell basically just didn't hold a vote on whether or not to confirm him. And so this goes through that in a little bit more detail. It says, President Barack Obama, a Democrat, nominated Garland to serve as the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court March 2016 after Scalia died. Republicans said that Garland was an acceptable choice, but then the Senate Republican majority refused to hold a hearing during the last year of Obama's presidency. And so Wikipedia, they of course call this an unprecedented refusal, and they're very aggressive, sort of it's pejorative against the Republicans. But eventually, nothing happened there. Garland's nomination lasted 293 days because Mitch McConnell didn't hold a vote on it. That nomination expired. They were presuming, of course, that Hillary Clinton was going to win. She didn't. So then, Donald Trump won and then eventually nominated Neil Gorsuch, who is now on the court. So Merrick Garland was somebody who was kind of in an alternative universe could have been on the Supreme Court. Had Hillary Clinton won, they probably would have had no choice but to confirm him, but that didn't happen. And so now he's back. He's back to be the Attorney General. And we've got a little bit of some information about the hearing that took place today. This came over from Law and Crime Today. The confirmation of Judge Garland never got from the Senate roughly half a decade ago. It has finally arrived with a twist. Now, instead of aspiring to be the Supreme Court judge, he is now wanting to be the top prosecutor in the United States, a role that left him to release a statement reflecting on the Department of Justice in a career that began encountering extremism. So we're going to get into his opening statement right now. Throughout the proceedings today, according to this article, Democrats sought to contrast Garland as an antidote to the prior administration attack on the Justice Department's independence, turning the page from a former president, Donald Trump's loyalists like ex-Attorney General Bill Barr, with a judge widely praised by both parties. So we're going to get into this. Let's take a look at his opening statement. As I said, I like to read some of the primary sources on this. Largely what you're going to hear today is what I have been reading today is sort of it's a lot of puffery of Merrick Garland, just a lot of sort of, over the moon. We're very excited about this guy. So, a lot of the media sort of is reading like that today. So I want to skip all of it. Let's go right into his opening argument, his opening statement that he gave on the floor of the Senate Judiciary Committee today in the Senate. So it says here, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and member of the Judiciary Committee, I'm honored to appear before you today as the nominee for Attorney General. I want to introduce you to my wife, daughters, son-in-law. They're all here and they're watching these proceedings on C-SPAN every day of my life. It goes on. The president nominates the Attorney General to be the lawyer, not for any individual, but for the people. July 2020 marked the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Department of Justice, and it's a fitting time to remember the mission. It is fitting time to reaffirm the role of the Attorney General, and that is to serve the rule of law and to ensure equal justice under the law. So as we're reading these, we just sort of want to point out some of these sort of legal phrases and see how they're using them. All of these, this guy's a lawyer, he's a judge, he's somebody who's been doing this for a long time. So his word choices are very distinct, right? They're carefully chosen. And it is a fitting time to recognize the more than 115,000 career employees of the department and its law enforcement agencies and their commitment to serve justice and protect the safety of our communities. That's a lot of people, 115,000 people under his leadership. If I am confirmed, serving as the Attorney General will be the culmination of a career I have dedicated to ensuring that our laws of our country are fairly and faithfully enforced and that the rights of all Americans are protected. So basically standard boilerplate language that you see here, nothing particularly interesting. Before I became a judge 24 years ago, a significant portion of my professional life was spent at the Justice Department. Special assistant, the last of the post-Watergate attorneys. He was a line assistant U.S. attorney, supervisor in the criminal division, finally as a senior official in the Deputy Attorney General's office. And it goes on. Let's see here. My slides are moving slowly today. Many of the policies the Justice Department developed during those years are the foundation for reaffirming the norms that will ensure, so reaffirming the norms, okay, so that's sort of a return to order, saying that the last 4 years were not normal. Now we're going to reaffirm the norms that we're going to adhere to the rule of law. Policies that protect the independence of the department from partisan influence in law enforcement. Right, that's sort of a dig at Trump, I'm going to guess. That strictly regulate communications with the White House, that establish guidelines for FBI domestic operations and foreign intelligence collection. Ooh, see, so these are juicy words. What are the FBI domestic operation guidelines? So that's on his list. What are the foreign intelligence collection? What are those? Those are important issues. That ensure respectful treatment of the press, unlike Trump, that read the Freedom of Information Act generously, which we can get behind, right? More information, more transparency, more accountability, that respect the professionalism of the DOJ's career employees and that set out principles of federal prosecution to guide the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. So some good stuff there, right? Some good relevant topics. Now, we can't glean a position on some of these things. We know that he's talking about FBI domestic operations. I can guess kind of where that's going to go, but we're going to see. But I think the point here is that he's flagging that. He's putting a pin in that. He's sort of raising that up. We're going to be looking at this. We're going to be looking at that, right? We don't see much here about, let's say, immigration. Okay, that one's just kind of not there. We're talking about foreign intelligence collection. We're talking about Freedom of Information Act. He didn't say much about drug policies. He does talk a little bit about prosecutorial discretion. He's sort of laying out the framework that he's going to fill in a little bit. So let's see how this continues on. In conversations we had before this hearing, many of you have asked why I would agree to leave a lifetime appointment as a judge. I've told you I love being a judge. I've also told you that this is an important time for me to step forward because of my deep respect for the DOJ and its rule and its department in ensuring the rule of law. Celebrating the 150th anniversary, this was founded during Reconstruction in the aftermath of the Civil War to secure civil rights as promised by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The first Attorney General appointed by Grant to head the department led it in a concerted battle to protect black voting rights from the violence of white supremacists, successfully prosecuting hundreds of cases against members of the Ku Klux Klan. Almost a century later, Civil Rights Act of 1957 created the Department's Civil Rights Division with the mission, quote, to uphold the civil and constitutional rights of all Americans, particularly some of the most vulnerable members of society. The mission remains urgent because we do not yet have equal justice. All right, so we're getting into some more policy prescriptions. So what are we going to do then, Judge Garland? If we do not have equal justice, what are we going to do now? Communities of color and minorities still face discrimination in housing, education, employment, and criminal justice system, and bear the brunt of harm caused by the pandemic, pollution, and climate change. So we are talking a little bit about criminal justice reform now, right? We're talking about unequal justice, and he's specifically calling out the justice system as it relates to criminal law. 150 years after the department's founding, battling extremist attacks on our democratic institutions remains central to its mission. Battling extremist attacks. So we're seeing that language again, right? More and more of that. We've made point of that here on this channel. Domestic extremism, domestic violent extremism. We've already seen reference here, the FBI looking into domestic operations, talking about foreign surveillance and collection. Now we're talking about extremism again and equal justice. So a lot of the same language that you would hear from elsewhere in this administration, it's of course bubbling up. Now he's sort of applying for a job there, right? He's going through the confirmation hearing. So you would expect to see this type of language. And of course he is giving it to you. Now let's take a look at 1995 to 1997. He supervised the prosecution of perpetrators of the bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building who sought to spark a revolution. Does that sound familiar? Does that language sound familiar? That would topple the federal government. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like maybe somebody who has experience in handling a 1995 to 1997 revolution that was trying to be sparked by the Oklahoma City bombing. Maybe they would be relevant right now because, according to many out there, there was something similar that took place on January 6th. So he's sort of hearkening back. He's saying, look, the biggest threat, Joe Biden, the biggest threat, Kamala Harris, the biggest threat to the majority senators who are in this chamber now are Democrats, and their biggest issue, largely that we've been hearing, or one of the biggest issues, I can't read their minds, but one of the biggest issues is white supremacists. It is insurrectionists. It is fear from this violent overthrow of MAGA Trumpists. And so he's going back now and saying, listen, I already dealt with people who wanted to spark a revolution in this country. I already dealt with people who wanted to topple the federal government before. I did that with the Oklahoma City bombings back in the 1990s. That's why I'm qualified for this position. It's just a job application, and he knows who he's speaking to. If confirmed, I will supervise the prosecution of white supremacists and others who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, a heinous attack that sought to disrupt the cornerstone of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power to a newly elected government. So strong proclamation there that he's going to be prosecuting white supremacists and others who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And I'm still looking forward to seeing what his sort of guidelines are on that, because there are currently a lot of, which I don't disagree with that, right? I think that I've said this consistently. Anybody who did storm the Capitol and breached it and caused damage should be prosecuted. if they're not prosecuted, then it's going to really wreck the entire justice system. I've made this point before. I've said if for some reason, somehow, there's a drop of 100 cases, everybody's going to be crying foul on this thing, and it's going to, I think, result in a worse judicial system than if we didn't formally prosecute the people who were involved at that date and time. And I know that might sound weird coming from a criminal defense attorney, but I just believe that to be the best way forward. If we did not prosecute them, then there's going to be, crying foul from every different angle, every different person in this country. Does that mean that they should go to prison for 20 years if they didn't really do much harm in the building? No, I don't think so at all. There are many people that we've covered on this show who showed up the day after or showed up that night and had no part in storming the building. Are they going to be prosecuted under this Department of Justice? Probably, right? And if it sounds like they're going to be prosecuting white supremacists and others who stormed the Capitol. So we'll see what that means, right? We just don't know what that means. If you were there, if you showed up the day after, we already know that they're currently prosecuting people who did not storm the Capitol. So what does that look like? Well, we're going to find out. This critical work is a part of the broad scope of the department's responsibilities. DOJ protects Americans from environmental degradation and abuse of market power, and from fraud and corruption, and from violent crime and cybercrime, and from drug trafficking and child exploitation. So then we get a little bit of some of the other things they do, right? So we have some immigration talk there, abuse of market power. Don't see anything about tech in there. We do see violent crime. We see cybercrime, right? What is he talking about? What is cybercrime now? Is it posting memes? Because this DOJ arrested somebody for posting memes in 2016. Now, they were in election interference types of claims, but they were memes on the internet. They were trolling. Is that a cybercrime or not? Well, it is under the current DOJ, but what is he going to do if he is confirmed? And it must do all of that without ever taking its eye off the risk of another devastating attack by foreign terrorists. The Attorney General takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I am mindful of the tremendous responsibility that comes with this role. As Attorney General, later Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson famously said, "The prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. The prosecutor's discretion is tremendous. While prosecutors at their best are one of the most beneficent forces in our society, when they act from malice or other base motives, they are one of the worst." Yeah, and that's a pretty relevant quote, right? We see this a lot in our practice. Prosecutors can be very reasonable. They can be very accommodating. They can be very, I would say, inclined towards justice, and they can be the exact opposite of that. They can be very hard-headed. They can be very difficult to even have a conversation with, very stubborn, and they can really result in a lot of injustice. And so it's nice that he points that out. Jackson then went on to say, "The citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness and who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches the task with humility." That was the kind of prosecutor I tried to be during my prior service in the DOJ. That is the kind of spirit I tried to bring in my tenure as a federal judge. If confirmed, I promise to do my best to live up to that ideal as Attorney General. So kind of a little bit of a vanilla statement. I think that the only thing that you get out of there is a little bit of the white supremacy stuff. Of course, they're going to prosecute Capitol Hill, but this is a job application. The Democrats are in control of the Senate, so he is applying for the job, and he's telling them exactly what they want to hear. Of course, we're going to go after the white supremacists. We're going to go after the insurrectionists. We're going to, really sort of look at domestic FBI protocols. We're going to look at foreign collection of evidence. And then he just goes through and sort of checks the box, right? Silent crime, violent crime, drug trafficking, child exploitation, abuse of market power, environmental degradation, peaceful transfer of power, white supremacists, got it. Revolutions, got it, right? On and on and on and on. So not much to glean from that. Now, it was an opening statement. So today we have 3 clips that we went through so we can sort of dive in a little bit. Now, if you recall, we spent a lot of time on this with Amy Coney Barrett and some of the other judges when they were going through their confirmation proceedings. Not going to spend that much time. We've got about 3 clips here. The first one I think is very emotional, and this kind of gives a good insight into Merrick Garland, somebody who is emotional and actually has a lot of kind of depth to the person, right? And I wanted to play this one because I thought it was it was sort of heartfelt, right? I mean, I think he's genuine in a lot of what he says, and so let's just get this one up so you can see what I'm talking about here. It'll make more sense when I play it.
Senator, so I come from a family where my grandparents fled anti-Semitism and persecution. The country took us in and protected us. And I feel an obligation to the country to pay back. And this is the highest, best use of my own set of skills to pay back. And so I want very much to be the kind of attorney general that you're saying I could become. And I'll do my best to try to be that kind of attorney general.
I believe your heart, and I'm grateful that you are living that Micah mandate.
All right. So, when I hear that type of language from people in our government, and you see that kind of emotion and you see that type of expression coming out of them, I want to support that, right? We want more people like that in the government. I think more people should be a little bit more, understanding of some of the amazing things that this country has to offer. It sounds like he's recognizing that. Sounds like he sort of appreciates the things that make America good. And if he is going to go and try to do his best in that framework, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. At least I am. And we're going to see what he does. Now, if his policies come back out and they are in violation of the Constitution, or in my opinion, they are things that would make America not so great, right? The things that made America great when him and his family came over, if they're trying to water those things down or those underlying principles, yeah, we're going to hold him accountable to that. And I presume he's going to be confirmed, and we'll have 4 years of being able to hold him accountable and analyze his decisions and make sure they are in comportment with the Constitution. But today, we're not going to beat him up too badly, right? Let's just see what he has to say. Seems like a nice guy, has a lot of experience on the federal bench, in the federal courts, and so we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, not without a full pass, right? In this next clip, I think this is where he's having a conversation with Josh Hawley. Many people are still a little hot around the edges when it comes to Josh because of his role in something. I don't even know what it was, but because he objected to some of the electoral votes, which he's constitutionally allowed to do. People are still hot about that, but whatever. He's back on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and here he was asking questions from Judge Garland. And so one of the things that comes up, of course, as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States is, well, how are you going to enforce the law in certain contexts, right? We've seen the Capitol Hill riots. We've seen a lot of summer unrest. We've seen more and more protests that are still bubbling up and sort of smoldering around this country. And so Josh Hawley is asking him specifically, what's the difference between domestic terrorism? How do you define that? Because we've seen a lot of stuff. We've seen in Portland them throwing Molotov cocktails at a federal courthouse for months. Is that domestic terrorism? Here's Josh Hawley with Merrick Garland today.
Let me ask you about assaults on federal property in places other than Washington, D.C., Portland, for instance, Seattle. Do you regard assaults on federal courthouses or other federal property as acts of domestic extremism, domestic terrorism?
Well, Senator, my own definition, which is about the same as the statutory definition, is a use of violence or threats of violence in an attempt to disrupt democratic processes. So an attack on a courthouse while in operation, trying to prevent judges from actually deciding cases, that plainly is domestic extremism, domestic terrorism. An attack simply on a government property at night or any other kind of circumstances is a clear crime and a serious one and should be punished. I don't know enough about the facts of the example you're talking about, but that's where I draw the line. One is both are criminal, but one is a core attack on our democratic institutions.
All right, so as you can see, that came over from Breitbart. They did a nice job clipping some of the good clips today, so go check them out if you don't already do, though. They have quite good reporting over there. So a couple points on that, on what he just said. So it's this, you have to sort of tease out where he's drawing the line. What is domestic terrorism? So according to him, the line is drawn when there is an actual disruption of a governmental proceeding. Right, that was his definition of it, which is kind of different than the way I've seen it. In Arizona, the way that it works here, we have a terrorism statute here, and it's if you're trying to influence a decision. Right, so just think about that. So one is if you're trying to influence a decision, if you're trying to go out there and do something that is, terrorism related, and you're intending to do that in order to manipulate somebody's minds or to cause them to do something differently. So one example here that we just covered in Arizona is there was an officer who was at a town hall meeting, and we covered the story on the show, but this officer is sort of in a group with other people. They're talking about Mayor Gallego, who's a mayor here in the city of Phoenix, and she was talking about, sort of playing around with this defund the police movement. Right. And this officer was with other officers at a town hall discussing this issue. Well, what if the mayor moves some money around with the city council and they defund the police? Well, we have a police officer who's attending one of these things, and he says, if she does that, I'm going to shoot her in the head. Right? Terrible statement. We covered this. This was in the news. And another officer who was there said, you don't mean that. And he said, yeah, I do. I mean that. And so when we talked about this in the context of the show, of course, that officer didn't get charged. Maricopa County Attorney's Office here reviewed that and said, no, we didn't think it was a real threat or anything like that. But I know other people historically who have been charged with a terrorism charge for that. The reason being is because you're making a statement in order to influence somebody else's opinion, right? So that officer in this hypothetical is making a statement to influence an outcome, a political decision. I will do X unless they do Y. If she defunds the police, then I'm going to do this. In other words, she shouldn't defund the police and I won't do this, right? It's a statement to try to influence a political decision. And that's kind of a more, I would say, standard definition, at least in the context of where we practice in criminal law. I don't know what statute he was referring to on a federal level that says it's interference. That's sort of more in an alignment with, an insurrection. And so they were sort of talking about domestic terrorism, and they're trying to define when that is. So, you could make an argument on both sides. You could say, yep, it's only when they're in session. So if you go to a court building after 5 o'clock and you firebomb it, that's not terrorism. But if you do it while they're in session, that is terrorism. Seems kind of a weird way to distinguish just based on time, right? Because if you firebomb a court building and the building burns down, you just interfered with the next day of work pretty clearly, right? Everybody's going to show up and their buildings burn down. Everybody's going to show up and there's protests outside. They can't get into the building because there's barricades and it's dangerous. So it's one of those distinctions that I just think if you try to, this is what judges do. This is what attorney generals do and prosecutors do. They compare and contrast. And they take two cars. They say, this one's red, this one's white. This one has a 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder. This one gets 25 miles per gallon. This one gets 50. And you sort of weigh them and you say, all right, this is the better vehicle for me to make my case. This is the better vehicle for me to operate. And you mix and match and you compare and you contrast them. And so what he's trying to do right here is to distinguish between prosecuting, this is my opinion of this, he's trying to distinguish why it's okay and justified to prosecute the Capitol Hill rioters, but not the summer unrest protesters, whatever you want to call them, Antifa, BLM, whatever. And what's the distinction? It's time. So he's trying to find a distinction between the two. In Capitol Hill, they right in the middle of the day, they were in session. Therefore, that's domestic terrorism. But anybody in Portland, anybody who was part of the BLM protests that Kamala Harris bailed out when they burned down the 3rd precinct out of Minneapolis, that was after hours. So those people cannot be prosecuted as domestic terrorists. So now you know, right, from our incoming attorney general. If you want to avoid domestic terror charges, this is not legal advice, but according to his own standard, right, it doesn't qualify for that if it happens after hours, if it's not in session. And so when you're thinking about being an attorney general and talking about policy prescriptions for the entire country, you got to think about those things, right? Because now you could have a group of people, they just conduct their attacks after 5 p.m., whatever their local situation is. So, one of those answers that feels like he's trying to thread a needle, wants to prosecute the Capitol Hill people, but not anything that took place over the summer. We'll see how that works out. Here is another clip. We got Lindsey Graham now, who's asking him about the border. And the border, many people think, well, it's just immigration, customs enforcement. It's kind of a different division. It's not within his purview. But you got to remember, right? A lot of allegations of criminality are coming across the border. People saying it's human trafficking, drug smuggling, illicit trade, illicit goods, all sorts of problems at the border. Lindsey Graham is asking him if he's ever been to the border and if he knows anything about drug cartels exploiting the border. And his answer is, well, you can be the judge of it. Here it is.
Have you ever been to the border? Have you ever been to the U.S.-Mexican border?
No, sir, I haven't.
So I'd like you to go, because I just got back, because I learned that drug cartels are using our asylum laws against us. They will collect people to sort of rush the border, and once they're apprehended, they will claim asylum, and most of these claims, 90%, are rejected, and that will take resources away from securing the border and detecting drugs and protecting the nation against terrorism. This is a behavior by the cartels. Will you look into that practice of using asylum claims by drug cartels to weaken border security?
I had not known about this, and I will certainly look into this problem. I think the drug cartels are a major menace to our society, and the poison that they put into our streets is damaging communities of every kind. If they have a particular, if they have
I ask you to visit the border. I think you'll find patriots there, and when they make mistakes, they need to be held accountable. But that's one of the toughest jobs in the country.
All right, so kind of a bizarre line of questioning there from Lindsey. Well, kind of a yes, good, and no, bad from Judge Garland. I would say I think that first and foremost, I like the sort of the language that he is using in terms of being a law enforcement official. If he's talking about the drug cartels as being a problem, in my mind, what I can infer from that is maybe he's less inclined about prosecuting the drug users, right? Right now, what we see are a lot of people being prosecuted for low-level drug offenses, serious felonies, at least here in Arizona and many other parts of the country. And in my opinion, those people need help and treatment. They don't need incarceration. So currently, the way that our current justice system is set up, in my opinion, is it's very, very overly punitive for the users rather than the producers. And, law enforcement loves all day to go round up the users. They're very easy to round up. But the bigger problem is where a lot of this stuff is coming from. And, he's, as the chief law enforcement officer, talking about going after the cartels rather than the users, which would be a little bit of a different, change of course from Joe Biden specifically. Over the last 30 years, all of his crime bills, he has been very, very aggressive in prosecuting the average user. First offense, mandatory prison for crack cocaine during the 1980s. Of course, that really impacted African-American communities largely more than other communities. And they were just users, not necessarily people who were distributing the drug. So it's sort of a little bit of a change in course in terms of policy. So we'll see where that goes. On the downside, though, guy's never even been to the border, and he's not aware that the cartels apparently may be exploiting some of our immigration laws and some of the same policies that the Biden administration is going to be promulgating according to their new immigration plan and policies in order to facilitate more criminality into this country. So kind of just, oblivious to that. But he's an East Coast guy, Harvard guy, DC guy, been around Washington and the establishment for his entire life, sort of birthed and raised and bred within that vertical. And so, what can you expect from somebody like that? But he's answering questions, and we'll see what the Senate wants to do. Let's jump into a couple questions on this segment. We have here from Liberty or Death says, thank you, SCOTUS. Now we know the Constitution is just a suggestion. Courts and executives can write law if there is a pandemic. And Liberty, you're one segment ahead of us. That's going to be the next segment. We're going to talk about SCOTUS. We're going to go through the dissenting opinion from Judge Thomas. _Shade said, saw one clip of Garland today, was not impressed. Threw Biden's name in there to hide behind. No, he didn't sound or feel confident to me whatsoever. No feeling of a leader. And that's a good observation there, _Shades. I actually think that is pretty accurate, right? He doesn't have a big personality. He doesn't have sort of a Bill Barr, walk into the room with a lot of bravado. Bill Barr, during his last Senate Judiciary Committee, when Eric Swalwell was asking him questions, did you prosecute so-and-so? Did you subpoena this? And Bill Barr says, no. And Swalwell says, well, why didn't you? And he goes, well, why should I? Right? He was sort of a big personality, big bravado, sort of like a movie-ish lawyer, somebody who can go in there and just kind of manhandle the room or person handle the room, right? Whoa. But this is a situation where, Merrick Garland is sort of a small personality, kind of quiet, a little bit meek, kind of, kind of working for his words. We saw there in that exchange with Holly that he's, domestic and really thinking and digging for it. And, he's not going to be a trial lawyer. He's not going to be out there presumably in court, but he will be somebody who needs to be called in front of a lot of hearings and committees and things. So I can understand that critique. He's not particularly a strong advocate, vocally speaking. And well, we'll see where that goes. Good observation, though. We had Liberty or Death says, Garland said solitary confinement in prison is bad, but it is okay for governors to enforce lockdowns if it is deemed necessary for the safety of the people. I didn't see that clip, Liberty or Death, but that doesn't surprise me. I mean, largely what you get, I think, in these proceedings is somebody who is applying for a job, and so they're just going to tout whatever the generic administration party lines are, and he did a good job of that today. Wise One said, if a petition is signed, how many signatures do we need in order to get the election audited? So, Wise One, that's going to be entirely dependent on the specifics of what you're asking about. So, if you wanted to go to, I think, Wisconsin, they wanted like $7 million, and then they would just do it for you. In other words, you don't need signatures. You just need to pay the $7 million. Trump, I think his team paid like $3 million for a partial re-audit. So it just kind of depends on the state, the locality, what you want done. And they'll be able to give you more details on that. Want to Know says, did he answer any question or know anything at all? He just kept talking, but not saying much. Reminded me of Biden on court packing. Yeah, probably, right? That's probably true. I didn't watch the whole thing entirely. I just watched clips here and there. And you got to remember, right? These confirmation hearings are largely kind of just show pieces. They're looking for stuff unexpected, but you can make the same criticism about any candidate up there. I think you could make the same criticism about, Amy Coney Barrett or some of these people. They go up there, they answer the bare minimum because that's the right thing to do legally. Okay, when let's say we go to trial, we put our client on the stand. One of their instructions is do not answer more than you have to, right? Just keep it concise. Yes, no questions if you can, and minimize the amount of time that you talk. And that's, I think, exactly what's going on with Garland and most of these other nominees. So I know it's frustrating if you want answers to certain things, but you're not going to get them. Thank you for the question, Want to Know. Next one up is from Sharon Quidney. Any prison or criminal justice reform would be great. What I'm afraid of is that this regime is going to be coming after libertarians like me, anybody who supported Trump, maybe even white people in general. Yeah, I know, Sharon. So I think the libertarian comment is exactly right. I think the supported Trump comment is exactly right. And I can't really speak much on that last one, but they are talking a lot about sort of changing the conversation about it. And I don't know where that goes or what that means because I'm not an expert in that field, but I will tell you, that we're seeing new language, right? We're seeing domestic violence extremism. Well, what does that mean exactly? What does domestic violent extremism mean? What does racial equality versus racial equity mean? They're two different concepts with two different worldviews and two different paradigms and two different philosophical underpinnings. What does that mean? And that's what we're trying to glean here. We just have to have these continued conversations with these individuals to pin them down. And then once they do give you an answer, then we can hold them accountable to that standard. Liberty or Death says, how was the, quote, raid on the Capitol white supremacist when those that wanted the vote counted differently wanted Trump a white guy over Biden a white guy? They put the constitutional amendment to ban desegregation. Maybe someone should tell the blacks and Hispanics and Asians that stormed the Capitol that they are white supremacists too. The videos I saw, to quote the Democrats, look like America. Or am I missing something? So good question there, Liberty or Death. That's a provocative question for sure. I think one of the things that, so two comments on this, right? Something that happened, two things that I noticed, right? Number one is it was a real quick rush to judgment on the white supremacy stuff. A lot of that, right? Everybody who was there was a white supremacist. Okay. That was sort of the generalization. Then we saw two things interesting happen. Number one, before January 6th, Enrique Tarrio, who is not a white person, who is the leader of the Proud Boys, was arrested. Right. So the Proud Boys apparently was this white supremacist organization that was headed up by somebody who's not even white. So, right there, you're going, wait, what? Then right after Capitol Hill, many people were pointing out that it wasn't just white people there, right? There were other people who were there of different demographics. And so we saw an article come out shortly thereafter that said, how did they phrase it? It was something like stopping minority whiteness or something like that. I pinned the article. I think we talked about it on the show. There was an article. Maybe Miss Faith can find it. I can't remember where it was, but it's stopping minority whiteness. In other words, you are somebody who is identifies as a minority, but you still have some whiteness in you that is causing you to be a racist. And so there was an article from the New York Times. I can't find it right now. I'm going to find it at some point. But it's basically saying the people who stormed the Capitol Hill building that were not white were exhibiting minority whiteness or something like that. It was this convoluted way to say that even if they were not technically white, they were still white. Therefore, you can take this and connect this all back to white supremacy. It was a wild article. I have it saved somewhere. I have a screenshot of it somewhere. So, it's hard to make sense of it all the racial stuff and who's responsible for what, and everybody's trying to point their fingers at everybody else. It's tricky. We've got another one from Pinky2 says, my concern is staying with the Constitution. We are only hearing Dems say cancel whites and help minorities. Dems only want to say that. America needs someone that prosecutes anyone that did wrong, not according to political view, and helping minorities as long as they are not harming any other race. Well, yeah, Pinky, I agree I think that justice should be blind. And I know that is, in and of itself, people say that is a racist connotation, right? That justice is not blind, and that there's this established patriarchy of white male privilege and all of these different things, which are really hard to quantify, right? I still don't understand how it all works necessarily, or how they want to codify this, or how they want to pass a bunch of laws to deal with all this stuff, or what the solution is, other than to recognize it and have conversations around it. I don't know. But apparently they don't want many more conversations around it. So it's kind of hard to even talk about it, because if you do, you're going to get it. Somebody's going to get triggered and offended. And I just don't know. There it is. So Miss Faith pulled this up. Here it is. Just so you know, I'm not making this up. It's called multiracial whiteness. Think of this, folks. Opinion. To understand Trump's support, we must think in terms of multiracial whiteness. Okay. So here is Enrique Tarrio, who is not a white person, from what I can tell. It doesn't look like that to me. I think he's Cuban. Enrique Tarrio, that's him. Leader of the Proud Boys. And then we have this headline, to understand Trump's support, we must think in terms of multiracial whiteness. So even if you are multiracial, even if you're a different race, you also have whiteness in you, and that is responsible for your actions on the Capitol Hill protests, on the Capitol Hill riots. Therefore, you're still part of a white supremacy organization. You're just going, what the hell is happening, right? What world am I living in here? The Trump administration's anti-immigration, anti-civil rights stance has made it easy to classify the president's loyalists as a homogenous mob of white nationalists. But take a look at the FBI posters showing people wanted in the insurrection assault on the Capitol. Among many of the white faces are a few that are clearly Latino or African American. Such diversity highlights the fact that President Trump's share of the Latino vote actually rose in 2016, notwithstanding years of incendiary rhetoric. Yes, they're disproportionately white, but one of the more unsettling exit polls shows that up to a third of Latinos voted to re-elect Trump. So it's all, many black and brown voters, all of them stopped the steal movement. Then we think of Tarrio, by contrast, rooted in America's ugly history of white supremacy, indigenous dispossession, and anti-blackness. Multiracial whiteness is an ideology invested in unequal distribution of wealth, power, privilege, land in the form of hierarchy and standing of one section of multiracial whiteness reflects an understanding of whiteness as a political color, not simply a racial identity. All right, so it's confusing, folks. I don't know how to make sense of this. I thought you had to be white to be a white supremacist, but apparently you don't. It's confusing. Somebody help me. All right, we got Liberty or Death says, response to Garland's Jackson quote, enthusiasm for a cause sometimes warps judgment. Former President and later Chief Justice William Howard Taft. Enthusiasm for a cause sometimes warps judgment. Thank you, Liberty. We got another one. We've got from Sharon says, I'm sorry, I don't buy that Garland clip as being sincere. Maybe I'm just cynical, but it seems to me that Dems are expert at playing on people's heartstrings, but are really guilty of overacting, AOC and the others. You're tough, Sharon. You're pretty tough. Who knows? Who knows? He seems way more genuine than AOC does. When AOC was over there in her white outfit, crying, hanging off the chain link fence outside that immigration center. Oh, come on. That was Instagram material. Okay, I'm a millennial. I can recognize Instagram material when I see it. Garland's, that wasn't Instagram material, right? That was just, some oldish guy on the floor of the Senate, just kind of, all right. I mean, speaking as a millennial, right? Oldish, right? It's not being pejorative. I happen to love old people. But my point here is, one seems genuine. The other one seems like it's AOC Instagram material. And Garland didn't hit that. But Sharon, you've got a discerning eye. So you might be right. We have Chris Wiseman. We got a Photoshop in the house, folks. We got a Photoshop, the big, beautiful spotlight of accountability and transparency. Thank you, Chris Wiseman. Chris Wiseman in the house delivering. It's kind of like the bat signal, R&R Law Group, into the sky. Beautiful spotlight of accountability and transparency. I love that, Chris. Thank you. That kind of made my day. That's fun. And, maybe one day we'll get one made up and I'll put a little mask on and I'll fall to my death off a tall building. We got Sharon Quidney says, looking at the Senate scene, do any of these people even know an ordinary person, a small business owner, a contractor, a builder, a laborer, a waitress, a truck driver? Very good question, Sharon. Probably not. Okay. I mean, if you are somebody like Merrick Garland, you went to Harvard College, Harvard Law School, you got a job at a massive law firm, you go into the Department of Justice, you become a judge. I mean, you sort of live in DC in that little bubble your whole life. He's never been to the border. He doesn't know, any of that stuff. And it's a whole different world, which is why I'm just such a big proponent of local. Think local. Because we know what's going on in our backyard. I've been born and raised in Arizona my whole life. I think I probably know significantly more about the border than Merrick Garland does. But he's in Washington, 2,500 miles away. He's going to pass rules that come and touch us here, even though he doesn't know anything about it by his own admission. Another one from Pinky Suit 2 says, okay, well, the OKC bombing would fall in line with what he's describing. He's prosecuted there. I'm from Oklahoma, so it was intense here. I'm hearing him say that even if a federal building is closed at night, it's still a crime. I could see his point if he does still go after both criminals, including the summer unrest rioters. Yeah, it's a good point, Pinky, right? So he didn't say that one was a crime and one was not a crime. He was just categorizing it. And I think I kind of glossed over that point, right? They are both crimes, but he's just categorizing them differently. And that's a big deal. Domestic violent extremism is a whole different can of worms than something like criminal trespass, which is a low-level misdemeanor, or destruction of property, right? Probably a misdemeanor, depending on the amount of destruction, might be a felony. But if you're talking about domestic violent terrorism, that's a whole different category. It's probably, life in prison under the federal statutes, depending on what statute he's talking about. So totally different game there, but we'll see where that ultimately leads. I think that his distinction was pretty bad, though. I mean, if it's just open or closed distinction, what does he do if they torch a building after hours? Does that count or not? All right. We got Chris Wiseman says, Garland was a pretty good record on FOIAs and transparency as a judge, but mixed on Fourth Amendment cases. So this is Freedom of Information Act request, generally favorable to judicial deference to the state with respect to law enforcement and wartime executive power. Very troubling if you classify domestic extremists in 9/11 style commission and domestic patriot acts. Yeah, so some good insight and some good opinions there from Chris. So according to Chris, says, good transparency as a judge. We all like that. Mixed on the Fourth Amendment cases. Fourth Amendment are typically your search and seizure cases. A lot of law in there in that realm, but search and seizure cases, typically liberals are sort of in alignment with my political philosophy on this. Sort of the joke is that conservatives on the court can never find an officer who did anything wrong. Right. Every single cop. Well, they would have found it anyways. Inevitable discovery doctrine or whatever it is. Right. Many of them were objecting to Miranda rights and things like that. Whereas the liberals typically are better, in my opinion, on criminal justice stuff. They're more about sort of individual rights, more about search and seizure rules being adversarial toward the government. The government has to prove a higher burden than many of the conservative judges will care to admit. So good little synopsis there from you, Chris. Appreciate that. Rob, from Jason Segal, how would you answer that question about the essential defining characteristic for domestic terrorism, the inside-outside business hours thing or other criteria? So it's a very good question. Basically, I think a better framework would be whether the action is intended to manipulate a policy, right? And so you have to just kind of think about this back. What is the root goal of terrorism? It's to cause terror in people, right? It's to scare the hell out of people so people don't do certain things. You can make the argument 9/11 was about a penalty towards the United States for interfering in the Middle East, right? Very broad, simplistic argument, but they didn't like the U.S. being involved overseas. They committed an attack on this country in order to change the U.S. policy. So the U.S. stops interfering overseas, right? It's a very simplistic example. Actually, I don't think that's probably even 1% of really what happened there, but it's just an analogy, right? They took an action against somebody to influence the policy of that thing. And so, yeah, if you are a Capitol Hill rioter and you are intending to interfere with the government to change a policy or to change a prescription, yeah, I think that would qualify. But I also think that the the summer unrest people, same thing. If you're peacefully protesting, that's one thing. But if you're torching a Minneapolis 3rd Precinct building, if you're going to call the Capitol Hill rioters domestic terrorists, which I'm not sure that that's a fair definition, but if you are going to call them that based on Judge Garland's own distinction, right? They were open during business. And if they're closed in the summer, I think that's a poor distinction. So I would say that the better way to just categorize them all would be to say anybody who wants to get out there and interfere with the functional operation of government is intending to do so to manipulate the political course that government entity is on. And anybody who is interfering with that is more closely aligned to this concept of terrorism, because it's a policy-based action versus not. So back to my hypothetical about the police officer, they were saying something and threatening something in order to achieve an outcome, a political outcome. So I think that's a better line in the sand versus somebody's open, something's closed. That doesn't make any sense. So we'll see, right? We'll see where that goes. Ma Fox says, I think people are vastly misconstruing the point Garland made with distinguishing horrendous criminal acts with acts of domestic terrorism. He's not saying that they did in Portland isn't criminal. He's specifically explaining it was deeply criminal, but not domestic terrorism by his definition. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Ma. And if I skipped over that, I didn't mean to do that. He does say very explicitly, both are criminal. But my concern here is what is the difference between the two? Because if you classify something, so like let's take an example of gang crimes, right? In Arizona, at least, if you are let's say you commit a crime, it's one set of penalties. But if you commit a crime and it's part of a gang, it's a whole separate onslaught of penalties, significantly worse depending on what the underlying offense is. So just that designation opens up the door to a whole lot of other things. Same with domestic violence. Maybe that's a better example. Okay, if you get into a fist fight at a bar in the middle of the night with some random guy, that's going to be assault, maybe trespass, maybe disorderly conduct. If you get into a fight with your spouse at home, it might still be even lesser, but because you're in a domestic relationship with that person, maybe nobody's even injured. But because there was disorderly conduct, it's now designated a domestic violence offense that automatically revokes your right to certain benefits. Can't return to the scene of the crime. In Arizona, there's questions over your ability to own a gun. It's a whole can of worms. So you have these modifiers. So here, if it's criminality in Portland, but it's criminality plus in Capitol Hill, why is that? Because one was open and one was closed? Are you serious? That's it? That's a pretty inconsequential distinction, in my opinion. right? Somebody's going to get a domestic terrorism charge because they were there while the government was open. That's it. They're going to get another 10 years in prison because they were open and not closed. That doesn't make much sense. But we'll see where he goes with that. I think he was probably grasping for an answer and he didn't have a good one. But Merrick Garland, so we'll continue to follow that. I don't think that he's been confirmed today. He might get confirmed tonight. But if not, we'll have updates on Merrick Garland tomorrow. So stick around, subscribe. And if you missed that, we took those questions from Locals, locals.com/watchingthewatchers. If you want to ask questions on the next show, that's where to do it.